The signal came through the black of space like a scream in the dark. It was old, it was cracked and full of fear. It was not meant to be heard by Deathworlders, but they heard it anyway, across systems and sectors and stars. The signal passed through empires, through trade routes, through protected zones, and into the silence. Beyond, most ignored it, some blocked it, a few listened, and quickly deleted it. It was a message from a dying world, a desperate voice crying out as cities burned and skies cracked and the ground split open under the weight of something no one wanted to name. The message was short. It said, "Help us. They have returned. They are not dead, please. If anyone hears this, we cannot stop them. Help us, help us, help us." And then it ended with static silence and pain. Far from the center of galactic politics, on the edge of known space, in a blue star system that most empires avoided, the signal reached Earth. No delay, no filter, no translation required. The Terran system absorbed the signal and processed it without ceremony. The machines understood the distress, the words, the tone, and more than that, they understood what was hidden beneath the voice. The data signature, the pulse, the frequency. They recognized something ancient, something buried in Terran records, sealed long ago and never spoken aloud, something that made even the machines pause within. Minutes Earth responded, not with ambassadors, not with questions, not with a message back. No, the Terran response was movement. Clean, cold, fast, a fleet began to form. Ships, black and silent, broke orbit and drifted into position. Engines warmed, hulls sealed, weapons activated across the solar system. Stations turned their sensors toward the source of the signal. Military councils met without public knowledge. Orders were given without fanfare. These were not ships of peace, they were warships. Carriers, dreadnoughts, mobile fortresses, filled with soldiers who had trained for one thing: to end threats before they could grow again. They moved without delay, without debate, without need for permission elsewhere. Across the galaxy, other species watched from afar. They saw the signal too, and when they noticed Earth's response, they laughed. Small, nervous laughs. They said, "Of course." The Deathworlders respond with violence. They said, "Earth has always been too aggressive, too unstable." They said they will probably make things worse, but they did not move. They did not answer the call. None of them did not. One, not even the old empires. Not even the so-called peacekeepers. None wanted to face what might be on the other end of that signal. But Earth moved on board. The lead ship, a young officer, watched the data feed. He had never seen a signal like this before, but his superiors had. And the moment they saw it, their faces changed. They became silent. Their hands tightened. Their eyes filled with something he could not name. Not fear, but memory, something deeper, something colder. They told him the mission was not to rescue the aliens who sent the signal. It was not to provide aid or assistance. It was to end the cause of the message completely. And without hesitation, the officer asked if that meant total removal, and the answer was yes. Full deployment, full erasure, full silence. No survivors, no escape. The world that sent the signal was called Zavros. Not important to most maps, located far from trade lanes. Orbiting a dying red sun, once a place of art and learning, now reduced to broken towers and bleeding soil. What attacked them was not fully shown in the signal, but Earth knew. They knew, without needing to see the full image. Old files were opened. Locked names, reviewed. One word stood out again and again. Morvax, creatures from the dark days of the galactic past. Things that vanished before Earth rose. Things that should have stayed forgotten. Earth had fought them once, long ago. Far beyond any known record, the battle was erased from history. Not because it was lost, but because it was too dangerous to remember. Earth had silenced the Morvax before, and now they would do it again. The Deathworlder fleet moved faster than light through silent space. The soldiers inside prepared in silence. No songs, no banners, just the quiet checking of weapons, the final seal of armor, the long, deep breaths of those who knew what waited on the other side of the stars. The young officer looked at his reflection in the dark window and asked himself why no one else had answered. Why had only Earth chosen to act? Maybe they were the only ones who truly remembered what real monsters looked like. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was something else. Maybe Earth simply refused to let the past crawl out of its grave. The fleet passed into the outer rim space and picked up more pieces of the broken signal, small data chunks, images of ruined cities, towers falling, skies on fire, and voices screaming until they were cut off suddenly, as if swallowed whole. The officer stared at the screen and saw something in one frame, a shape. not quite seen a form that twisted the air itself, and his breath caught. He did not know what it was, but he knew it should not exist. He turned to his commanding officer and asked if this was the right path. The officer did not smile. He did not blink. He only said, "We finish what others fear to start. We bury what should have stayed buried. We are Deathworlders, and we do not ignore the call when it comes," and that was the end. Of that, the fleet entered warp, the stars stretched, the silence returned, and in that silence only Earth moved, only Deathworlders heard the SOS, and what followed would be brutal. The Deathworlder fleet moved through the void with purpose. Their ships were unlike anything the rest of the galaxy had seen. Massive black, silent engines pulsing with cold fire, each hull covered in thick armor and hidden weapons. Their movement was silent but unstoppable, like shadows drifting through space. They passed stars and broken satellites and dead worlds without slowing inside the ships. Soldiers prepared without songs, without speeches, only with focus and silence. They had done this before they knew what waited for them, and they knew what was expected of them. This was not a mission of mercy. This was not a mission of hope. This was extermination. The commanding officer of the fleet stood before a wide screen that showed the distant world of Zavros, still many jumps away, but drawing closer every second. The planet's orbit was decaying, its atmosphere fractured, its continents broken by something that moved beneath the crust. Some of the crew believed the planet was already lost. Others believed it could be saved, but their beliefs did not matter. What mattered was the presence of the Morvax. If the signal was true, if the Morvax had returned, there could be no hesitation and no escape back on Zavros. The few remaining cities had gone silent. The first to fall were those closest to the deep scar where the Morvax hive had erupted. Old tunnels, long sealed, had cracked open and black smoke poured into the sky. The local defense forces tried to fight back, but their weapons failed, their walls collapsed, their soldiers were torn apart without warning. The Morvax were not like other enemies. They did not march, they did not speak, they did not threaten, they consumed, they spread, they twisted everything. Around them, buildings became nests, streets became tunnels, and the air itself grew heavy with the scent of decay. One surviving alien named Relo sat beneath a half-collapsed tower with a broken arm and blood on his face. He had sent the SOS, not expecting anyone to respond. He knew most of the galaxy feared the Morvax and would not dare face them, but something deep inside had told him to send the message anyway, to try one last time. And now, as he watched the sky for ships that would never come, he wondered if he had been wrong. He wondered if hope was just a cruel trick. But then the sky changed high above Zavros. The stars began to move, the clouds split apart, and a faint glow pulsed across the upper atmosphere. Satellites captured the shapes. First, long dark outlines stretching across the sky like a curtain, then more shapes, faster, sharper, heavier than anything the local systems had ever recorded. The Terran fleet had arrived without warning, without message, without delay. They formed a wide net above the planet, scanning every square meter, locking targets, confirming locations, and preparing strikes inside the lead ship. The order was given, and the bombardment began. Beams of concentrated plasma slammed into the ground, where the old Morvax tunnels had reopened. Missiles streaked across the sky and burst with blue fire. Heavy rail cannons launched payloads that shattered rock and steel alike. The first wave was precise. It targeted the core nests, the hive entrances, the known growths, and as fire rained from above, the Morvax answered. They screamed, not in pain, but in defiance, not through mouths, but through the air itself, through vibration and sound waves that cracked the earth and shook buildings into dust. In a command center buried beneath the lead ship, the human officers watched the data feed carefully. The Morvax had grown faster than expected. Their tunnels were deeper, their numbers larger, but it did not matter, because Earth had come prepared, not just with firepower, but with understanding. Long ago, they had fought these things in secret wars across lost worlds, and in that war, they had learned one terrible truth: the Morvax could not be reasoned with, they could not be contained, they only stopped when nothing was left to consume. The fleet continued to strike the planet. The Terran ground forces deployed massive drop pods, slammed into the surface, unfolding into armored platforms that unleashed troops and machines. Alike walkers strode across the ash-filled plains, scanning for movement. Drones flew overhead, dropping sensor beacons and tagging targets. Soldiers in sealed armor advanced into ruined cities, moving through smoke and rubble in total silence, their weapons humming with hidden energy, their helmets displaying data and threats in real time. Rilo crawled from his hiding place when he saw the first human soldier. He was terrified not by the Morvax this time, but by the figure in black armor standing in the smoke like a statue. Holding a weapon as tall as he was, the human turned its head, scanned Rilo, and without speaking offered a hand. Rilo took it, slowly, confused but alive, and the human said only one word, "safe," then turned and continued forward, firing into the dark. As more Morvax rose from the ground from orbit, the commanding officer watched the reports. Flood Inhumans were encountering resistance, heavy resistance, but they were holding the line more. Importantly, they were pushing forward, pushing into areas. No other force could survive, the Morvax screamed. They swarmed, they attacked with claws and teeth and raw psychic energy, but the Deathworlders held steady, their minds strong, their machines stronger. They did not break, they did not retreat. They advanced. Talian observers from other civilizations watched the broadcast from their hidden stations. They saw the human fleet. They saw the destruction. They whispered to one another that the humans had lost their minds, that this was overkill. This was madness, but deep down they knew it was fear, not madness, fear, that if they had gone instead of Earth, they would have been wiped out in minutes, because Deathworlders were not like them. Deathworlders did not hesitate. Deathworlders responded. With everything and still, the humans pressed forward as the second night fell on Zavros, and the fires continued to burn. One of the human soldiers looked at the remains of a Morvax drone and shook his head. He said quietly, "They were not supposed to be here again. We buried them once already, and now we'll do it better this time." Wind howled over the broken ground, the sky burned with fire and light, and somewhere deep in the tunnels, the Morvax queen began to awaken, and above it all, the Deathworlders stood waiting, ready, unshaken. Only they had heard the signal, and only they had come. What followed now would not be mercy. The air above Zavros turned red as fire fell from the sky. Each impact sent shockwaves across the broken land, shaking buildings and splitting hills wide open. Entire zones, once occupied by the Morvax, were now burning craters. The human fleet in orbit remained silent, their ships unmoving like sentinels of judgment, casting death from above with mathematical precision. They did not respond to hails, they did not explain themselves, and they did not ask for permission. They came to finish something. Not to negotiate, not to reason, and certainly not to retreating the ruined city of Varnock. A squad of human soldiers moved through the rubble, their boots crushing blackened debris, their eyes watching every shadow. The buildings were silent, but the walls whispered. The sounds were not real, but the vibrations were. The Morvax were close nearby. They had gone underground again, weaving through old tunnels, nesting deep within the bones of the planet. The humans knew this pattern. They had seen it before. In another war, a war erased from galactic history, a war where Earth fought in silence and buried the truth. The lead soldier of the squad, named Holt, by his unit, lifted his hand and everyone stopped. He stared at the wall ahead of him. It was cracked, but not empty. Something moved inside, slowly, steadily shifting like a heartbeat. Behind stone, he raised his weapon, a heavy plasma rifle shaped like a hammer, and aimed. The rest of the unit followed, without speaking, without needing a command. They understood this rhythm. They had trained for it, lived it, breathed it. The Morvax would not surprise them, not this time. Wall exploded outward, not with sound but with force. A creature emerged, long and spined, with black limbs that bent in impossible ways, its eyes glowing with cold light, its skin pulsing with wet motion. It screamed, not with noise, but with pressure, a psychic blast that would have broken most minds, but not the minds of Deathworlders. Their helmets filtered the wave, and their brains, hardened through generations of survival on Earth, were ready to resist. Holt fired once the beam sliced through the creature's torso, turning it to ash. Before it touched the ground, another came from behind a pile of rubble, and a third from a crack in the floor, and then 10 more from above, dropping like insects from a ceiling of broken metal. But the humans did not fall back. They moved together, like a machine covering each other, forming a triangle of death. Every movement, practiced every shot, clean every breath, measured the Morvax, screamed again and again, but could not reach them. And when the final one fell burning on the floor, Holt gave a nod, and the squad moved on. No celebration, no words, only Deeper underground, in a forgotten part of the city, an old relay station flickered to life. The remaining alien survivors had gathered there, hoping the humans could reach them. Some still feared the Deathworlders, others worshipped them, calling them The last fire before darkness, one of the survivors, named Tevin, tried to keep everyone calm, his voice steady. Though his eyes were filled with the same fear as the rest, they had seen their world fall in days, their cities become nests, their people taken and twisted into things that walked on too many legs and spoke in dreams suddenly. A loud grinding sound filled the chamber and the ceiling above. Them split open and a massive pod dropped into the center. Dark Armor stepped out, pointing a scanning device around the room. His face was hidden, his movements smooth. Tevin stepped forward and tried to speak, but his voice cracked. The human turned to him, scanned him, and nodded, then lifted a small device. From his waist and spoke into it, his words came through a speaker in broken translation. Safe confirmed extraction pending, and then he stepped aside, and more humans dropped in silent shadows, landing like thunder wrapped in black metal and fury back. In orbit, the command center on the lead Terran ship processed the surface data. Multiple nests had been destroyed, but new ones were forming rapidly. The Morvax had adapted faster than expected. Their spread was wide, their hives deeper in some areas. Of the planet showed signs of ancient structures not made by the current race, not even made by the Morvax. Something older, something that hummed at frequencies beyond measurement. The Terran commander stared at the scans and said softly, "It is not just about killing them this time. We have to end the route whatever it takes." The next wave of deployment was authorized orbital strikes. Grew more intense, and deeper probes were launched carrying payloads designed to dig into the crust and detonate. At key seismic points, it was not just war, it was cleansing, and in the middle of it, the humans moved without mercy, one group at a time, pushing further into the darkness of Zavros, entering tunnels that had not seen light in thousands of years, and what they found there changed everything. Deep below the ruins of the first city, a massive chamber opened before the advancing soldiers. It was not part of the Morvax hive. It was older, smoother, made of metal that did not rust, with symbols that glowed. Softly, when touched, one soldier placed his hand on the wall, and the symbols flashed blue, and the air shifted. The room responded like a machine waking up, and from the far end of the chamber came a sound, not a roar, not a screech, but a hum, low and rising, and terrible. Something was awakening, not Morvax, something else. And the humans did not hesitate. They raised their weapons and prepared for what came next. Because they were Deathworlders, because they knew the cost of hesitation, because they had heard the signal and come not to listen, not to speak, not to save, but to finish what no one else could. The underground chamber was larger than any structure recorded on Zavros. It stretched far beyond the scans, with walls that breathed softly, pulsing with dim blue veins of strange energy. The Terran soldiers moved inside slowly, weapons ready, lights sweeping across the floor that was made of a material smoother than glass, yet tougher than steel. They were trained to face the Morvax and trained to destroy them, but this place felt different. Not Morvax, not natural, something older, colder, more calculating. The squad's leader, named Brett by his team, raised a signal to hold. He knelt beside one of the glowing lines and placed a sensor pod down. Readings spiked instantly. Gravity was wrong. Time itself seemed slower inside the chamber, and the air did not carry oxygen or nitrogen or anything the soldiers needed, but their suits filtered it all, and they pressed forward knowing they had no other choice. The deeper they went, the louder the humming became. It was not mechanical, but living. A resonance that touched the bones and whispered of ancient thoughts. Behind them, the walls closed. The tunnel that led them inside was gone now. Sealed by the chamber itself, some of the soldiers hesitated, but Brett kept moving forward. Knowing they were already too deep to go back, the mission remained clear. Remove all traces of the Morvax, eliminate the route of their return. And if this was where the Morvax had risen from, then this was where the fight would end, even if it cost them everything. Meanwhile, on the surface, other units engaged in constant battle. Morvax swarms poured from the cracked earth, climbing ruined buildings, crawling through sewers, bursting from old reactors, but the humans stood their ground. They fought in pairs, in squads, and formations that moved like rivers around obstacles, over fire, under collapsing towers. Each soldier connected to the others through live feeds and Battlefield A. They tracked every movement, shared every scan, and adapted in seconds to the enemies. Changes above them, the sky turned black, not with night, but with smoke rising from destroyed nests. Orbiting ships continued their bombardment, and new waves of Terran forces arrived every hour. Drones deployed entire forests of sensor towers to map The underground network's human engineers began sealing known tunnels with fusion charges, while specialized hunter teams moved into the deeper ruins seeking the source of the Morvax spread. But the longer they fought, the clearer it became the Morvax were not just surviving, they were growing again, faster than before, as if something deep in the planet was feeding them. A sealed bunker near one of the last surviving alien cities, a meeting took place between a Terran officer and the few local leaders still alive. The alien spoke nervously, unsure whether to trust the humans, unsure whether to fear them more than the Morvax, but the officer made no threats. He showed them footage from the old war. He showed them data hidden from the galaxy. Entire worlds consumed before Earth had stopped the Morvax once and hidden the truth to prevent panic. The officer explained that what was awakening now was not just the Morvax, but the ancient source that had once created them, something left unfinished. He told them that Earth had buried this evil once, not because it was easy, but because no one else could, and now that it had returned the same, truth remained. Only Deathworlders could end it again, and they would do so even if the planet had to be shattered to ensure nothing remained back inside the chamber. Brett's squad reached the central core, a pillar of black light. Rising from the floor to the ceiling, where no end could be seen around the pillar, floated fragments of Morvax bone and armor, broken and melted and rearranged into strange patterns, as if something was trying to rebuild them but did not understand. How the light pulsed slowly. With each pulse the walls trembled, and the soldiers' helmets filled with static. Then came a sound, a voice not through ears but through the spine. It spoke in no language, but every soldier understood it. The voice said, "Welcome back," and they knew it was not the Morvax speaking, but the architect of the Morvax, the intelligence that had designed them long ago, before memory, before light, something that had been locked away, sealed beneath layers of code and metal and time, something that Earth had once silenced, with forbidden weapons and erased from history because its thoughts alone could twist life into horror. The voice continued, "You came again as you did before, to burn and bury and seal us. We remember your flame, your fury, but this time we have learned, this time we will not sleep again without warning." The pillar shattered, and from within rose a shape tall and thin, made of metal and flesh and energy all at once, with limbs that split and changed with every blink. It stared at them with no eyes, but they felt its gaze. Brett gave the command, and the squad opened fire. Beams cut through the dark, hitting the creature again and again, but it did not fall. It absorbed the hits, its body adapting with each strike. The chamber screamed and walls collapsed, and strange winds whipped through the air, tearing equipment from the floor. One soldier was pulled into the air and vanished. Another was flung into a wall so hard his armor cracked. Brett threw a beacon onto the floor, calling for orbital support, marking the site for complete sterilization. But the creature moved. Faster than the signal traveled, it reached into the beacon and crushed it, then turned its body into a form that mirrored the soldiers. Twisted copies of their armor, mocking their form. Brett knew they would not survive, not without help, not without firepower beyond what they carried. He activated his emergency transmitter and sent a final message to orbit requesting full strike. No delays, no limits, total annihilation of the structure, even if they were still inside, because the thing they faced now, it was not just a weapon, it was the seed of an ancient war. Earth thought it had ended, and Earth does not leave roots behind. The battle-scarred sky still burned with fading trails of plasma as the brutal aftermath of the first clash hung in the air like a rotting scent, and across the ruined valley, the human forward base pulsed with energy shield barriers flickering. Under the constant strain of orbital debris and distant artillery strikes echoing from the hills beyond, the humans, however, were not retreating. They never had, and they never would. Instead, they had started building again even before the fires were out and the soil cooled. The engineers who had arrived with the second wave began laying down support columns, drilling deep into the alien rock with machines that hummed like growling beasts, and the survivors of the first battle stood tall, many of them still bandaged or limping but refusing to fall back, and at the edge of the perimeter stood Rin, his armor charred and dented, but his eyes sharper than ever as he stared out over the shattered landscape, knowing that the enemy was watching, waiting for the next mistake. But Rin had no intention of giving them one in the ruined city, once known as Eratai. The enemy had pulled back to regroup their forces, and strange signals had begun to appear across the subspace band's encrypted pulses that made no sense to human codebreakers. until the linguists uncovered something horrifying. The messages were not meant for allies or reinforcements. They were warnings sent to other species broadcasts of what the enemy had witnessed in the clash. With the Deathworlders, they described humans not as a military force, but as a catastrophe, a species that turned war into a storm, that consumed everything. The messages called them the silence, that followed the scream, the end of calculated war. And that fear was spreading because what the Deathworlders did was not just fight, they changed the battlefield itself, made it hostile not just to flesh and blood, but to ideas, to tactics, to the very logic of war. And now the enemy was learning. They could not win in the way they had before. Back at the base, Rin stood with Mira, the tactical overseer, and a few others around the holotable, displaying the terrain ahead and the clusters of enemy movement, which had grown more erratic, more scattered, like the enemy was unsure of itself. And Rin leaned forward, pointing to a line of ridges beyond the dark forest, saying, "If they take that ground, they will bottleneck us every time we move forward, so we hit them first, not with brute force, but with what they never expect: precision, discipline, brutality when required, but cold efficiency too." And Mira nodded because she had already seen the shift in the soldiers under Rin's command. They had gone from rage-driven survivors to machines of purpose, and the world itself was starting to respond because in the deep caves of the region, the native species began to emerge again, timid and careful, watching the humans from afar and whispering in their strange chirping language that maybe the old stories were true, that maybe the bringers of balance had returned, not in peace, but in the fury of fire. The next assault came at night, under the cover of a violet eclipse, and the enemy sent machines. First, towering constructs with multiple limbs and armor that shimmered like water in moonlight, they moved through the forest like silent titans, but the humans had already anticipated this and laid the valley with EMP traps linked to seismic sensors, and the first machine stepped into the path and triggered a cascade that dropped half the ridge on top of it before it could even lift its arms. And then the humans moved through the dust like wraiths, weapons silent until the last second, blades and kinetic rifles tearing through the confused enemy lines. And Rin was in the front, his movements economical, lethal, never wasting a single shot or motion. And beside him fought Mira, dragging wounded soldiers back and pushing others forward. And in the end, only ashes remained in the enemy path. When the sun rose, it cast golden light over the smoking battlefield, and the valley was silent again, save for the distant sound of new engines landing, human transports bringing more supplies, more people, and this time not just soldiers, but architects, scientists, terraformers. Because the humans had decided not only to fight, but to stay. They were not just responding to the SOS anymore. They were building something permanent, and this terrified the enemy more than any fleet or weapon, because it meant the Deathworlders did not just come to destroy. They came to reshape, and that meant their presence would not fade with the war their mark. It would last for generations, etched into the soil and sky-deep underground in the forgotten chamber of an old alien temple. A relay device blinked for the first time in centuries as the energy from the human base reactivated dormant systems, and a silent call was sent far beyond the known stars, a call not of distress but of awakening. And above it all, far beyond the clouds, in a forgotten satellite orbiting the system, an ancient observer turned its gaze to the planet, again noting the change in biosignatures and battle patterns, and in its database it adjusted a single entry under species classification, changing humans from potential threat to active galactic disruptor, and the data pulsed outward, unseen, unheard, until it reached a place where legends slept and something old stirred in the dark, waiting to rise. Still on the ground, Rin stood at the edge of the ridge overlooking the expanding base and the graves of the fallen lined with stones, not just for humans, but for alien allies who chose to fight beside them. And he did not speak for a long time, until Mira asked what he saw out there, and he answered not with words, but with a quiet nod and a hard look, because he saw it all. The war, the cost, the coming storm, but most of all, he saw the future shaped by Deathworlders, and he knew they would not stop until every SOS across the stars was answered with fire and hope intertwined in the same breath. The silence in the sky did not last long as more human ships pushed through the torn void of space. Their arrival was like thunder rolling through the stars, one after another. They came, each vessel darker and larger than the last. They moved like Silent shadows wrapped in steel and fire. With every ship that arrived, the enemy fleet lost another piece of courage. They had not expected more. They had not planned for retaliation. They had expected the first wave to break and fall. But the were not done. They were just getting started, and they had heard the cries from the edge of the stars below, the ruined mining colony, the survivors gathered near their broken walls. Children, old ones, workers, and fighters, they had waited for death instead. They saw fire from above falling like judgment. The human commander stood before them, face grim, voice steady. He spoke, not with pride, but with duty. "The enemy will not return." He said, "We are not here to rule, we are here to protect. No one else came. When you called, so we answered. And now the enemy must learn what it means to wake the Deathworlders in orbit," the command ships released. Dark clouds of autonomous drones, each one fast, silent, deadly, they slipped into the broken lines of the enemy. Tearing through metal and shielding with impossible precision, there was no warning, no sound, only cold destruction. The enemy fleet tried to scatter, but space itself felt like it had turned against them. Every direction they turned brought them face to face with another human weapon, another machine built for the sole purpose of ending them. The AI systems that powered the Deathworlder vessels moved faster than thought, predicting every move, adapting to every trick the enemy tried. They were not just fighting humans, they were fighting the combined rage and intelligence of a world that never gave up. The leader of the enemy fleet watched from his command ship, trying to understand how everything had gone wrong. They had crushed weaker worlds before. This was not supposed to happen. This world was supposed to die like the others, but they had not accounted for the humans, and now the stars burned with human vengeance from one side of the sector to the other. Distress signals from his own fleet echoed back with no answer. Ship after ship, lost systems went dark, cries for help unanswered, because help would not come. The humans were not playing. They were ending this, and they would not stop until the threat was wiped clean. The ground, the survivors saw more human dropships descend with supplies, weapons. Medics, soldiers moved with discipline, but their eyes held a cold fire. None of them spoke of victory. They moved with purpose, saving who could be saved, clearing rubble, scanning the skies for more signs of danger. They knew the war was not done. The enemy would regroup, would try again, but now they had made a mistake. They had shown themselves. They had woken something ancient and terrible, buried deep in human nature. The part that never surrendered, the part that remembered every scream, every lost colony, every child left behind. Deep in the mountains, far from the colony, the human engineers activated an old device, a beacon lost for centuries, built long ago when humans first reached for the stars. It was a call to others, a signal that Deathworlders had returned. And they were not alone. Soon responses came not just from Earth, but from other human outposts. Hidden allies, forgotten colonies, the scattered pieces of humanity were waking up, and they had all heard the same message. One of their own had cried out, and now the cry would be answered in lacrosse. The galaxy, the enemy's allies, hesitated, unsure what to do. Some wanted to run, some wanted to strike before the humans could grow stronger, but fear held them back. They had seen the footage. They had seen the ships that moved like ghosts and fired with the heat of suns. They had seen the faces of human soldiers, cold calm, ready to die if it meant. Their people lived, and they remembered the old warnings, the ones they had laughed at. They are from the death world. Someone had said long ago, never push them too far, because they do not stop. They do not forget in the shadows of a shattered moon. The last remaining enemy warlord gave the order to retreat. They would hide, they would wait, but deep down he knew it would not be enough. The humans would come not out of revenge, but out of duty. They would come not with hate, but with resolve, and that was worse, because humans had never needed hate to be dangerous. They only needed a reason, and now they had one. As the Deathworlder fleet moved deeper into enemy space, burning away resistance like fire through dry grass, the message spread faster. Then light Deathworlders heard the SOS, and now they were awake again. The galaxy would not forget what it had stirred, and what followed would be remembered in silence, in scars, in the cold emptiness where once mighty empires stood, because Deathworlders were not just soldiers. They were the storm that followed when no one else came. The battlefield was no longer a place of strategy, but a place of pure chaos. The screams of wounded soldiers and burning machines filled the sky, and even the strongest warriors hesitated to move forward. But the Deathworlders did not hesitate. They moved through the storm of fire like they were born in it, and in many ways they were. They had grown up in places where survival was not a right but a reward, where every breath was earned, where weakness meant death, and now all that suffering had become their greatest strength. The alien invaders had brought their worst weapons and their strongest. Warlords expecting submission, but what they found was a wall of fury, a force that did not bend even when outnumbered, even when surrounded, and Broken Kale moved through the burning remains of the enemy's last assault line. His armor scratched and dented, his helmet cracked, and his body bleeding, but his grip on the rifle never shook. The last defense point was just ahead. The uplink station, the heart of the enemy's command. If they took it, they would cripple the invaders for good, but getting there meant charging through the last division of the enemy's elite warbeasts, towering monsters with metal hides and plasma breath. They had slaughtered entire colonies before without even slowing down, but this time they were facing something different behind. Kale came Mira, her eyes sharp and her movements fast. Every step she took was a promise of vengeance. Her brother had died in the early days of the invasion, screaming into the void as a warbeast crushed their bunker. She had sworn that his death would not be forgotten, and now she ran toward the thing that had taken him from her, alongside Kale and the others who had lost just as much. Each Deathworlder had a reason to fight, and none of them would back down. Not now, not when they were so close. The ground shook as the first warbeast charged. Its roar thundered across the ruins, its steps breaking steel and stone alike, but Kale stood his ground, firing shot after shot into its eyes. The creature flinched, and Mira leaped into action, climbing its leg with a blade in hand, and no fear in her heart. She drove the blade into its neck and twisted hard. The warbeast shrieked and fell crashing to the ground as the others charged. More beasts, more fire, more pain, but the Deathworlders moved like fire through a forest, unstoppable and hungry. Every second felt like an eternity, but they pushed forward. The enemy tried to regroup, tried to surround them, but the Deathworlders had learned every pattern, every move, every weakness, and they used it. All their weapons burned hot, their fists broke bone, their rage shattered even the thickest armor. The warbeasts fell one by one until the path was clear and the uplink tower stood tall in the distance, silent and waiting. Kale limped forward, his leg barely working, but his spirit unbroken. He reached the tower and placed the charge. The others circled around him, watching for one last trap, one final blow, but nothing came, just silence. As the tower exploded into fire and smoke, the signal was dead, and with it, the control systems of the enemy faltered across the sky. Their ships began to veer off course, their warbeasts froze, confused and wild. Their soldiers panicked. For the first time in the entire war, they looked like they might lose, and the Deathworlders saw their chance. They called for the rest of the fleet. They sent the signal that the heart of the beast was gone, and now was the time to strike. Within minutes, the sky filled with human ships, black and red, burning with light and vengeance. They descended like a storm and tore through the enemy lines. The Deathworlders on the ground watched as their brothers and sisters in orbit brought the same fury from above that they had brought below. No mercy, no delay, only justice. The enemy tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to run. The humans had surrounded the entire sector. Every escape route had already been calculated and blocked. Every path turned into a trap. The invaders had walked into their own doom, thinking they were the hunters, when in truth they had been the prey from the very beginning. Mira stood on the edge of the ruins, her eyes burning with tears of rage and relief. She looked to Kale, who simply nodded and sat down on the rubble. Breathing heavy but satisfied, they had answered the SOS. They had fought through hell, and now they had won. The cost was high, but the message was clear. Do not call for Deathworlders unless you truly want salvation, because they will come. They will save what they can, but they will not leave anything of the enemy behind. Not even dust. The galaxy would remember this day, not for the blood, not for the fire, but for the truth that no matter how far or deep the scream came from, only the Deathworlders heard it, and only they answered with fire and steel in orbit. The command fleet sent out the final transmission to every world listening. The words were clear and spoken without fear. This galaxy is not yours to burn anymore. The protectors have risen, and they remember everything you did. This is the age of reckoning, and we are just getting started. And so, the war ended not with peace, but with warning. The Deathworlders had come not for diplomacy, not for talks, not even for revenge. They came because someone cried for help, and they were the only ones who cared enough to answer, no matter the cost, no matter the pain, no matter the blood that followed. The galaxy would never forget what came next, but even in the ashes of broken worlds, a truth now echoed across the stars: when the Deathworlders rise, They do not come to negotiate, they come to finish what others are too afraid to start, and so they vanished into the dark once more, waiting for the next scream, waiting for the next fight, because Deathworlders do not rest, they do not forget, and they do not forgive. The fires in the sky had dimmed, but the echoes of what had happened still rumbled through every mind across the stars. The message that was meant only for help had turned into a thunderstorm of justice and terror, and every world, every station, every distant moon now knew the one unshakable truth. When Deathworlders hear a cry for help, they do not send aid alone, they arrive as a force of nature. Their will unbending, and their fury, unmatched, the Deathworlder fleet had returned to the edge of their space, dragging behind them the wreckage of what once was a proud armada that had enslaved civilizations for generations. They had not only destroyed the machines of war, but had shattered the spirit of tyranny across the quadrant, the silence. Left in their wake was not from fear, but from realization that no empire, no force, no darkness can last forever against a people forged in survival and unshakable in their sense of justice. Captain Rain stood at the helm of the last ship to leave the ruined sector, his eyes heavy but proud. Behind him the crew worked not with celebration but with purpose, scanning frequencies, looking for more cries, more silent calls from the weak, the broken, the ignored. They did not come for glory, they came because no one else would, and that truth kept them moving, world after world, injustice after injustice. Like a storm that brings cleansing fire, they had become the reckoning. The cities once held in chains, children walked free again, their laughter echoing through streets that had only known silence and fear. The ones who had sent the original message, those forgotten souls, now stood tall, not because someone saved them, but because the Deathworlders reminded them they were never truly alone. Even across the cold vacuum of space, a voice can be heard, and when it reaches the right ears, mountains will move. New broadcasts began to ripple through the known galaxy. It was not from a government or council, but from the survivors themselves. It was raw and simple, a retelling of what had happened, not to boast, but to warn. If you rule through cruelty, if you bury your enemies under fear, then be ready for the ground to shake, be ready for the stars to darken, be ready for the Deathworlders. Because once they hear the call, there is no fortress strong enough, no army large enough to stop them. Some tried to question it, tried to spin stories of overreach and chaos, but the people knew the truth. They saw it with their own eyes, and more importantly, they felt it, the feeling of someone standing between them and the nightmare, the feeling of hope not promised by politics but delivered by warriors who asked for nothing in return, not medals, not parades, only silence to rest until the next storm. Back in the black reaches of space, the Deathworlder fleet sailed silently again. No songs, no banners, no stories, only movement, always forward, because there were still voices lost in the dark. There were still chains hidden behind false peace, and for every cry, they would answer until the stars no longer burned or until their last ship flew. Message had changed across the stars. Once it was a weak signal. Now it was a beacon, not of fear, but of faith. If Deathworlders come, you do not hide, you do not run, you watch and you remember, because what follows is not invasion, it is not occupation, it is the brutal end of cruelty, the unstoppable return of balance, and the reminder that even in the coldest parts of the universe, there are hearts that burn with enough fire to shatter empires. And, as one quiet child stared at the sky from the ruins of their home, now rebuilt, they whispered a word passed down from the day the Deathworlders arrived. A word that meant salvation, and fury and protection and truth. They said, "Thank you," and the stars seemed to whisper back the end.